Here's the list to scan of contrasting patterns. A listing to be utilized as an educational tool for maybe reflection, meditation, contemplation, pondering, what have you, as strategies can initiate a consciousness raising process. On the left side of the page are the adjectives describing the powerful positive patterns calculating above 200 on Dr. David Hawkins' scale. On the left side of the page are the ones calculating below 200. We'll start with abundance. In contrast with that which is excessive, we can see accepting compared to rejecting, the power of admitting in contrast to denying, aesthetic in contrast to merely artsy, agreeable rather than condescending, allowing rather than controlling, appreciative rather than envious, approving rather than critical, attraction versus seduction, authoritative rather than dogmatic, prepared rather than preoccupied, balanced rather than extreme, the beautiful rather than glamorous, beingness in contrast to havingness, believing rather than insisting, brilliant rather than clever, candid rather than calculating, carefree rather than frivolous, challenged rather than impeded, charitable instead of prodigal, cheerful rather than manic, cherishing instead of prizing, choosing to instead of having to, civil rather than just formal, concerned rather than judgmental, consideratory rather than inflexible, confident rather than arrogant, confronting rather than harassing, conscious rather than unaware, considerate rather than indulgent, constructive rather than destructive, contending rather than competing, courageous rather than reckless, defending rather than attacking, detached rather than removed, determined in contrast to stubborn, devoted rather than just possessive, diplomatic rather than deceptive, doing rather than getting, educating rather than persuading, egalitarian rather than elitist, empathetic rather than pitying, encouraging rather than promoting, energetic rather than just agitated, enlivening rather than exhausting, envisioning rather than picturing, equal rather than superior, erotic instead of lustful, essential rather than just apparent, eternal in contrast to transitory and temporal, ethical versus equivocal, excellence versus adequacy, experienced rather than cynical, fair in contrast to scrupulosity, frugal in contrast to luxuriant, flexible instead of rigid, forgiving instead of condemning, free instead of regulated, generous instead of petty, gentle instead of rough, gifted instead of just lucky, giving instead of taking, global versus local, gracious rather than decorous, grateful rather than indebted, harmonious rather than disruptive, healing rather than irritating, helpful instead of meddling, holistic instead of just analytic, honest instead of just cash register legal, honoring instead of ensuring, humble instead of diffident, and humorous versus sober, impartial versus righteous, ingenious versus scheming, inspired instead of mundane, intentional instead of calculating, intuitive in contrast to literal, inventive instead of prosaic, inviting rather than urging, being involved instead of obsessed, joyful instead of just pleasurable, just instead of punitive, kind instead of cruel, leading instead of coercing, liberating rather than restricting, long-term rather than just immediate, loyal instead of chauvinistic, merciful instead of permissive, modest instead of haughty, natural instead of artificial, noble rather than pompous, nurturing rather than agreeing, observant rather than suspicious, the value of openness instead of being secretive, optimistic instead of pessimistic, orderly in contrast to confused, outgoing instead of reserved, patient instead of avid, patriotic instead of nationalistic, peaceful instead of belligerent, polite rather than obsequious, powerful versus forceful, praising instead of flattering, principle rather than just expediency, being privileged in contrast to entitled, prolific in contrast to barren, purposeful instead of desirous, receiving instead of grasping, freeing instead of tenacious, reliant instead of dependent, requesting instead of demanding, respectful instead of demeaning, responsible instead of guilty, satisfied instead of sated, selective instead of exclusive, serene in contrast to just being dull, serving in contrast to ambition, and sharing in contrast to hoarding, significance instead of importance, sober instead of intoxicated, spontaneous instead of impulsive, spiritual versus materialistic, steadfast instead of faltering, striving instead of struggling, surrendering instead of worrying, tenure versus being hard, thoughtful rather than pedantic, thrifty rather than just cheap, timeless instead of faddish, tolerant instead of prejudiced, practical instead of contrary, trusting rather than gullible, truthful rather than falsehood, unifying rather than dividing, unselfish in contrast to self-seeking, valuing instead of exploitive, virtuous instead of just being celebrated, worn rather than feverish. You've been exposed to the list. You're no longer the same person you've been before. You're welcome.